Hi everyone. We had to switch microphones. So my name is Daniel Russell. Thank you for the introduction. The introduction this morning was probably the best one I've ever received. I think you said that I had waded through years of genitalia to bring you the best of Snapchat, and that I am damaged. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. It was a good intro. Today I'll be talking about how you can get your brand in front of millennials with Snapchat. Snapchat is an interesting beast. A lot of people haven't quite figured it out yet. And so the goal of my talk today is to hopefully help you understand what type of content goes on Snapchat and how you can leverage it. I'm not going to go into the minute details of this is the link you click on to set up an ad, this is how you set up a geo filter. Instead, I'll be talking about how you can use Snapchat to get in front of millennials. So I've broken it down into 3 different groups here. The first is I'm going to be talking about kind of how we got here. Why is Snapchat kind of a rising king in social media? Next, I'll be talking about the actual functionality of it, how it, what its core feature set is, and why people are so interested in it. And then lastly, I'll be giving you some actionable takeaways that you can hopefully take and apply to your brand, as well as some case studies. So, how did we get here? How did Snapchat get here? Well, it started as a sexting app, lots of genitalia. Despite how much the founders like to try to disagree with this, it is true. One of the founders sent a picture of himself to a girl and instantly regretted it. Don't do that. Instantly regretted it and wished he could sneak in and delete it from her phone, but he couldn't. And that was enough motivation, a lot of motivation, to create this app. Snapchat rode this wave of kind of infamy, notoriety, this dirty sexting app, to a pretty big valuation. Early on, they were valued at $3 billion, and it was called utter silliness at the time. But the people that called it utter silliness then are certainly calling it utter silliness now. Snapchat is now taking money at a $20 billion valuation. And people do still call that utter silliness, but let's go through why it may be worth $20 billion and why it's worth your attention. So this is a graph of the monthly active users on different social media platforms from earlier this year. Snapchat is not very open with its usage data, so this is an estimate based off of the available usage data. But at the beginning of the year, it was estimated that Snapchat had an average of about 200 million monthly active users. So that is a bit smaller than Facebook. It's about 1/8 of Facebook's user base, and it's quickly gaining on Twitter and Instagram. Now keep that in mind, that relation between Snapchat and Facebook in mind. So Snapchat has 1/8 of the user base as Facebook. But look at this content consumption per second. On Snapchat alone, almost 800 hours of content is consumed every second. That is just mind-blowing for 200 million users. Compared to Facebook, which is around the 1,100, 1,200 hours of content per second consumed, Snapchat is punching way above its weight. So this user base is engaged. They are constantly churning out and absorbing content. And it's a ripe field for marketers who know how to play in it. It's also a ripe field for that wonderful demographic of kind of high school to early 30s where all of the advertisers are trying to get. Snapchat's reach at the end of last year in the 18 to 24-year-old demographic was nearing 65%, which is, again, just crazy. 65% of the 18 to 24-year-olds in the United States could potentially be reached through Snapchat with just 200 million users. So it is young. It is a young demographic. Part of it is because older people can't figure it out. And so hopefully I can help a little bit with that today. But it is just a gold mine when it comes to that younger demographic. And it's come a long way since its sexting roots. When college students were surveyed about it, the main reasons they said that they used Snapchat was because it allowed them to express creativity, it was good for keeping in touch, and a lot of them said it was even easier than texting. Only 2% said sexting. I don't know what the 11% of other necessarily is. Maybe it's tangentially related to sexting, I don't know. But most people are using it for these kind of creative messaging purposes. Marketers have taken notice. Just in the last year, interest in Snapchat marketing has doubled. But even though interest has doubled, I would say know-how and ability to market on Snapchat may have gone down. I don't know. There's a lot of false things being spread around about how you can use it, and there's not a lot of brands doing it very effectively. Even big brands. Mashable launched on Snapchat fairly early on, and they had to go through a whole Snapchat rebranding recently just because they were not quite getting it. So let's get some things straight. How does Snapchat work, and why are people using it? Well, first off, is Snapchat a social network? Not really. Not in the sense when we're talking about Facebook, Instagram, this kind of running feed where you can go back and Facebook reminds you about that birthday you had, 8 years ago or something. It's not quite that same social network. So here's how it works. You take a photo. Our photo here is a selfie. There's lots of selfies on Snapchat. You can add geo-filters. Confluence Conference is running a geo-filter here. So if you take a snap right now and swipe to the right, you can see the Confluence Conference geo-filter. Go Fish Digital is running one tonight at the happy hour. You can draw on it or add lenses. What's pictured here is the famous Puking Rainbows lens, which just modifies your face. And then you send it to a discrete number of your friends. It's not automatically published to all of your contacts. It only goes to a very discrete number that you have to hand select. And then it disappears. And that is the core functionality. Now, there's been some things added to it, some addendums. The Snapchat story is something that they added a few years back. And essentially, it starts to cross a little bit into that more traditional social media setup. But what you do here is you add any snaps that you take to your story, and then they're available to all of your followers during a 24-hour period. But they still disappear after a 24-hour period. You can't go back and watch them again. And of course, advertisers. Lots of advertisers are starting to get in. Coca-Cola's run so many different filters and things like that. But this is the core functionality. So what is it about these functions that makes Snapchat so special? Well, here's what sets it apart. And this is when we start getting into hopefully helping understand what type of content belongs on Snapchat and how you should use it and how you shouldn't. So this is what sets it apart. Interactions are not public by default. You have to hand select, remember, you have to hand select who you're sending things to. And for someone like me, this is great. I'm not very photogenic. One of my coworkers, before she started with us, thought that I was a girl based off of one of my photos. I don't know how that happened. I am not very photogenic, and so I love that Snapchat can only go to my mom, who's the only one that can appreciate, my photos. Or I can send different types of photos to my friends, and I can keep those things siloed off. There's also no record of the interactions that I'm driving. So people can't go back and look at my snaps. There's not a lot of risk for me writing on my snaps. If I send something really stupid, it's not necessarily going to haunt me a year later when I'm like, oh, that was stupid, Shouldn't have gone to that party. And you can't reshare those favorite snaps that you see either. There's no viral effect on Snapchat like there is on Facebook and Twitter, which is one of the reasons why it's so different from those other platforms. And you can't quite market the same. If I send a hilarious snap, they can't re-snap that to people. It's very difficult to share things. It's heavily image focused. There's a reason why images are such larger files when you put a file on your computer than a text file, and it's because there's so much information conveyed in an image. Where you're at, what you look like, what you're wearing, what the weather is. There's so much conveyed in an image. And for this younger demographic who may have shorter attention spans or just want more out of their time, it's important that you convey a lot of information in a short period of time. And finally, there's no way to find interesting users on the app, and this has been kind of a bane for marketers. I can't go in and type in snowboarders in Snapchat and get a big list of all of the snowboarding Snapchatters. I have to actually know their exact username, I have to know their phone number, or I have to have a picture of their QR code. And so there's no trending section like in YouTube. There's no you should follow like Twitter has. And so it can be difficult to find people, and it can be difficult as marketers to get your accounts out there. So in my opinion, what all of these differences mean is that Snapchat, maybe not fully, but starts to solve the attention crisis. For those not familiar, the attention crisis has been putting a lot of marketers and advertisers in a bit of a tumble for like the last 5–10 years. Because long-form advertising, 3-minute advertising segments between your content just aren't working anymore. People skip after 5 seconds as much as they can, so much so that YouTube has been introducing new 5-second ads because that's as long as they can get. Snapchat, it can only go up to 10 seconds. You can't go long. You can't be even tempted to go long. And so it helps kind of solve that attention crisis. It creates a bit of scarcity so that people are like, oh, I got to view this now. It might be gone later. I got to pay attention right now because unlike YouTube, I can't come back 2 years from now. So here's a quick summary of some of the changes that Snapchat has been making. One of the reasons why I wasn't so sure when Snapchat first launched as a sexting app how long it would stay, but because they have been making such solid updates over time, that's changed. That's changed quite a bit. And we don't need to go through all of these. This is more to illustrate the fact that they are launching major updates on a fairly regular basis. So as you can see, there are some major updates in 2013, again in 2014, several updates in 2015, and even as recently as about a week and a half ago, Snapchat made a major rollout of a new targeting platform that's very Facebook-esque, where you can target lookalikes and genres of content. But Snapchat is supporting both its users with new features and advertisers and marketers with new features. And so it's likely going to be here to stay. So here's how Snapchat makes money. In order for marketers to get involved, not always, but there usually has to be some sort of money changing hands. Right now it makes money by baking ads into stories. So those stories that I mentioned earlier, if you watch ESPN stories, sometimes a Coca-Cola ad will pop up in the middle of it that's like 5 seconds. There's sponsored filters and geo-filters, like the Confluence Con one that is set up right here. There's sponsored stories, again, like ESPN's sponsored story. There's asking users to pay for premium features. In the past, Snapchat has allowed you to replay snaps by paying. Now you can just replay snaps as much as you want. And they have revenue sharing deals set up with several different publishers like Refinery29, Mashable, among others. How they could make money, and how I fully expect them to get engaged in the coming years here, is sponsored snaps, so snaps sent directly to your inbox, suggesting certain brands to follow, so kind of like that Twitter suggesting who you should follow, but only for sponsored brands. And then premium vertical video content, kind of like a YouTube Red, where you pay a subscription to get access to special content. But even with all of that, I love this slide, by the way, it is not very marketer friendly. It just isn't. It's kind of the opposite of Twitter, where marketers are crying for happiness because 80% of the tweets you see are some sort of self-promotion or advertisement or, look at my new blog post kind of thing. It is on the exact opposite of the spectrum, over there with Reddit, where marketers are maybe not hated, but definitely not respected, and definitely not expected to be there. So how do we as marketers overcome that barrier to entry? Well, here are some best practices for marketers on Snapchat. Start by making your brand or your client's brand public. So my profile on Snapchat is public, meaning that if you follow me, I don't need to accept your follow in order for you to see my story. Anybody can view my stories. And brands often set this up because they want people to see their stories. Distribute your Snapchat QR code on other social media. Warby Parker, the glasses company, is doing a killer job at this. They have a big Twitter following, and so they're constantly pushing Snapchat on Twitter using different contests and coupon giveaways and things like that to get people on to Snapchat. Post stories when you do something cool. Emphasis on cool. Boring stories are not always the best, unless that's your shtick. Look how boring this is. Otherwise, keep it with the kind of cool things. Be creative. Like I said, Snapchat is not as buttoned up as other places. It doesn't need to be as polished. I was telling someone earlier that I'm not very active on Instagram because, again, that whole photogenic, photo thing kind of haunts me a little bit. And so that's why I love Snapchat. I can draw on my face so people can't see. Keep promotional material to a minimum. And this is where so many marketers get tripped up. As soon as they get on Snapchat, they're all pushing, check out our new sale, check out our new product, go to our website. And people won't follow that. They can voluntarily skip your snap. They don't need to watch it. And so they won't unless you are using actual valuable content that's valuable to them. Snapchat is more about the long game. It's more about building both brand awareness but also brand loyalty, so that when they do go to Google to search, they're like, you know what, I like that brand on Snapchat, they make me laugh. I'm gonna look them up first. And so it's not necessarily a transactional platform, but it's definitely worthwhile when it comes to building that brand engagement. And finally, it's okay if you don't post that much. A lot of people feel kind of anxious unless they're constantly posting. Snapchat is kind of nice about that. Like, if you don't show up for a week, that's okay. When you do show up, they'll say, oh wow, I haven't seen them in a while, and you'll probably get a higher click-through rate just because there's been some distance. That isn't always the case, but you don't need to feel that anxiety to constantly be engaged. With that being said, there's definitely some don'ts with Snapchat. Do not take non-adjusted horizontal snaps. Vertical video is the bane of my YouTube existence. I hate vertical video most of the time, but Snapchat is built for vertical video. It's not built for horizontal video. And so horizontal video on occasion is okay, but when you do use it, make sure that you are adjusting your text to be horizontal. Make sure that you're adjusting your filters. Don't stick with the 8-second long default snaps. When you sign up, that's kind of the default, is this 8 seconds. 8 seconds is a long time in Snapchat years. It's just kind of a long time to have your picture up there. I personally like the kind of 4 to 5 second range, unless there's a lot of text to read, which also don't probably use too much text. And part of that is because if I only send it for 4 seconds and it was really good, people go back and replay it. So I get extra coverage that way. Stay away from fan takeovers. It can go wrong so fast, as it can on so many social media platforms, but try to keep control of it. And never ever post expecting it will disappear. The sexters learned that early on. Now brands are learning it. Don't post it expecting that it will disappear. And Snapchat made that mistake, and I'll be able to show you that mistake in a second. Some metrics that I highly recommend you track. And some of these are obvious, some of them are not as obvious. Obviously track views on your snaps. Keep track of those views. One of the problems with Snapchat, and they're working on this, but there's not really a great way to track these types of metrics. Sometimes you have to build a spreadsheet and just track week by week inside your spreadsheet these different views and metrics. Next, track story completions. So when you are posting to your story, you're usually posting multiple videos or multiple pictures. So say you have 5 pictures in your story. People might view your first story 10 times. You'll get 10 views on your first story. By the time they get to your 5th story, there's been some drop-off. Usually we see about a 25 to 30% drop-off for every 5 snaps. Because there's that drop-off, that usually means that people aren't viewing all of your content. So if you can raise that completion rate, you can get more brand awareness. And of course, the number of screenshots is definitely worthwhile to track. If it was so good, if your picture was just so funny that people screenshotted it, then it was probably good content. Compare those 3 against these other 3. The number of snaps in your story. This is kind of a way to optimize it so that maybe 4 snaps is your magic number, maybe 10. The length of your snap and story, again, maybe 4 or 5 seconds is your magic number. Maybe 8 seconds is just going to work wonders for you. I don't know. And then, of course, time of day and the day of week performance. Now some case studies, and this is kind of the fun part. Richard Jefferson, Sweetgreen, Taco Bell, and Snapchat itself are my case studies for today. And the goal is to kind of show you both some good and bad examples of content on Snapchat applying those best practices. So Richard Jefferson. Richard Jefferson, for those who are not aware, is an NBA basketball player. He plays for the Cleveland Cavaliers. And he started snapping just last year during the season. So he's a relatively new snapper. Supposedly, this could be hearsay, but supposedly his snaps average between 3 million to 3.5 million views per snap now. And that's just been within a year, so he's built a big audience fast. This screenshot on the computer is a Reddit thread dedicated to how awesome his Snapchat is, and it got several thousand upvotes. But let's take a look at it real quick. So here is his Snapchat username in case you want to add him. I would highly recommend that you do. It's really funny. He goes behind the scenes, and Snapchat is so good for this. He goes into the Cavs locker room. He goes onto the Cavs retreats. He goes into, the different kind of team activities that they do. where there's no video cameras, nobody would normally be allowed there, but because he's a player, he's back there and making jokes with everybody, and it's just really personal content. He's now set up partnerships with both Tommy Bahama and Nike, and he does a really good job of introducing those products. Usually it's with a joke somehow, usually it's, again, using some kind of behind-the-scenes subject matter. With Nike, he's not quite as good. Sometimes he's a little over-promotional with Nike, but they might pay him more, probably. And then it's been great exposure for the Cavaliers. Cavaliers jersey sales have gone up. His jersey sales have gone up because he's so likable. Here is an example of his snaps, if it plays. Let's see. Oh, there's no audio.
Yeah. Why? Because Channing likes to be snow-coned?
Okay, I had to edit that, by the way. There's other things in there that probably weren't appropriate. Sorry the sound didn't quite work. The key here is that this is LeBron James, one of the most famous people in the world. And Richard Jefferson has caught him behind the scenes in the Cavaliers locker room. He was making fun of reporters, saying, "Are you going to slip on a banana peel, LeBron?" And that's just great stuff that people really like to see, especially if you're an NBA fan. Sweetgreen. Sweetgreen is a fairly large East Coast chain of salad restaurants, and they do a really great job too. They know their audience. And you can see here, the text might be kind of hard to read, but this is what dressing is your salad wearing? And they did this during the Emmys. And essentially, they would ask customers, as they walked out with their salads, to stand and then tell them what dressing their salad was wearing. And this played really well. People went to Sweetgreens to get involved on this kind of artificial red carpet. And so not only did it boost their sales for the day by getting more people over to their restaurants, but also it created more lifelong fans. So again, this is going behind the scenes. Sometimes they go back into the kitchen to show you how things are being made. They show you when the ingredients are being dropped off at 4 a.m., things that you might not normally see. They highlight the food and the customers, and again, with the Emmy Awards parties, they tie into the news cycle. Next up is Taco Bell. Taco Bell kills it on Snapchat. They do such a good job. Part of it is because the kind of funny food, genre plays really well into Snapchat. But this is the kind of stuff that they're churning out. Just this one on your far right just says, "Got that fire," and it's got a taco with flames drawn on it. And this just kills it with high schoolers. This is the kind of content that does really, really, really well. Why is it doing so well? Well, it's just it's quirky, but it plays into their food. This right here is a snap lens that they bought, and it turned your head into a creepy giant taco. And they did it for the Cinco de Mayo, which is, again, right up their alley. For the whole day, just to have that for the whole day, it costs an estimated $750,000 to buy that lens. But it got over 224 million views in one day. That views to dollar spend is pretty good. And there were a lot of 18 to 24-year-olds who might not have been thinking about Taco Bell specifically that were thinking about Taco Bell that day because they kept getting taco head snaps. So before we go to our more horror story Snapchat example here, these three examples have a couple threads in common. They don't take themselves too seriously. They're not buttoned up, right? For Richard Jefferson, it was very personal. Snapchat's kind of about that. When someone gets a snap from you, they know that you had to physically go and touch their name to send it to them. It's not like Instagram where it's just like, "Hey everybody, look at me, I'm so cool," right? It's like, Snapchat, I actually wanted to send this to you. Please open it. And so it's that more personable one-to-one feel. And then, again, just being able to know your audience. If your audience is the 50, 60, 70-year-old demographic, taco heads might not be the way into their hearts. But if you're going after that younger demographic, that kind of not taking yourself too seriously is just perfect. Now the horror story. Snapchat itself rolled out a Bob Marley Snapchat lens that turned anybody that used it into Bob Marley. And while that may have seemed like a good idea, and while since then the lens has been removed, they received massive backlash, as I'm sure you can understand. It's like a social media blackface type thing that just was not well received. They got massive backlash. Time, USA Today, CNN, all covered it in detail on a regular basis for like the next week. So don't take yourself too seriously, but it's always, if you're planning on doing something a little bit edgy, it's probably a good idea to run it by a few people first, because again, even though it disappeared after 8 seconds, it doesn't really disappear. Now the key takeaways from all of this. Don't use the same tactics you use on social media. Again, it's personal, it's less buttoned up. When you post something, it doesn't go out to everybody, you have to hand select it. It's about the long game. It's not about getting people directly to your website. You can't send somebody a link inside your snap photo. You could write it down, but then they'd have to go physically write it down into Google or somewhere. They can't just click on it. It's not quite the same, and so keep that in mind. Go behind the scenes. There's no need to get too personal with it. You know, there's no need to go to the hospital if you're having surgery or things like that, but feel free to go behind the scenes. Consider advertising. It's not always right. Advertising is not always the best play for you. It worked great for Taco Bell. It works great for a lot of those food, daily consumer brands. But if you're a real estate company, that might not be the best play. Instead, it might be more about fostering a community and establishing that long-term brand loyalty. Definitely make your profile public. It'll be hard for people to see your content if you don't. Stay away from those don'ts that I mentioned before. Make sure you're tracking metrics over time. Because Snapchat doesn't track metrics for you, it's one of those things where you have to be very proactive about it, or otherwise you'll just lose the opportunity to keep track of those metrics. And then, of course, minimal corporate promotion. It's about being personal. This is my Snapchat QR code. If any of you have Snapchat, again, my profile is public, and so if you were to snap this right now, you could add me and see my story. This is my email if you do have any more questions, if we're unable to talk. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. That was really great. Like, I actually feel like for the first time I understand Snapchat. The level of ignorance, of my own ignorance. I didn't realize that was a QR code.
Yeah, those little dots.
So long, yeah. Why are people doing this?
Yeah, some people thought it was like Braille or something, but you can't touch the screen, so it's the QR code. It's the QR code.
Mind blown? Oh, now I see where they put their picture in the... Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Daniel? I have one or two. Sir.
So I'm going to be able to convince my CMO to advertise on Snapchat before we launch a strategy.
Okay.
What are the things we should think about as we develop ads for Snapchat?
As we develop ads for Snapchat, what should we think about?
Quick follow-up to that. Is this ads for your brand specifically or for clients' brands?
Our brand.
Your brand. The kind of first steps that we typically recommend for brands that are starting to get into it is do an analysis of your current social profiles, figure out kind of what's been getting the most engagement, and then try to tie that into Snapchat somehow. So like I mentioned with Warby Parker, what understandably gets the most engagement is giveaways, when they're like, retweet us and you might be entered for a chance to win free glasses. Instead, they leverage that into follow us on Snapchat and we'll pick one of you, kind of a thing. So leverage the content and the platform that's been performing best on social. Then we also typically recommend to be fairly active at the beginning. I mentioned that you don't need to be active all the time, but at the beginning it's usually a good idea just because as people add you, you kind of need to remind them that you're there. Because again, they won't get some notification, some subscription notification that you just added something to your story. They have to physically go in and scroll through the story. So I recommend being more frequent with your content at the beginning. And then the last thing is making sure that you have your metric tracking set up beforehand. One of the things that gets sticky with people is because, for example, my Snap story that's live right now, I can go through and see how many people have viewed each of my snaps, but that's going to disappear in about 6 hours. And so I will never have access to that data again. And so having that process set up beforehand so that when you're in a mad dash to get those last items, those last metrics, you already have something set up to enter those in.
That's great. A question that I had is, the examples were really great. They really helped me understand what it really looks like for a marketer. Are there places that you go to see other examples? How do you find people who are doing it well, and who's talking about how you do it well?
Okay, yeah. So I mentioned Mashable at the beginning. Their Snap stories were a bit of a wreck because they were essentially trying to do YouTube on Snapchat. And again, vertical video on YouTube just doesn't work. Since they relaunched, they're doing a very good job at that long-form content on Snapchat. And long-form content means like 10 seconds. but they're doing a good job on that. Very, very polished kind of interviews, making sure that everything kind of plays into one another. That's one of the things that brands sometimes forget, is that even though they're separate snaps in your story, it can tell a story. And Mashable does a great job of that, of starting with, this is the point that we'll be talking about, here's what we talked about, here's what it means to you, and doing that across their Snap story. So I'm a big fan of that. If you want a good look at what that really personal content is, and again, this might not be worthwhile for your brand, but follow DJ Khaled. Do you guys know who he is? Okay, yeah. Follow him. You will laugh so hard. It is hilarious. He's a rapper and a music producer, and he snaps just like his whole life, and because he's a rapper and a music producer, his whole life is really interesting. and so follow that. He does a great job of getting behind the scenes, and it's hilarious.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you.